yesterday.
Right.
I know we had more people.
Brilliant. So everyone's now been warned by that mechanized voice that the recording is now on. But thank you so much again for joining us. Very quickly about the SPP background, I think most of us know who these two gentlemen are. This is Thomas Udison on the left-hand side and Bertrand Concret. They came up with the idea of the SPP back in the 2019 climate strike weeks, and they kind of initially introduced this as a business for inclusive growth initiative. But here we are now, a few years later, many thousand ambassadors around the world, something which is truly for procurement and by procurement. Predominantly all the members are from procurement. Jo, do you want to cover these principles?
Absolutely. So the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, just to recap on it, is based upon 5 core principles that we've got. The world is facing a tremendous environmental and social challenges, and we believe that as procurement, we have a critical role in contributing, steering and developing the response to supply chains. So the Sustainable Procurement Pledge addresses all of the procurement professionals, academics and students who want to become ambassadors and drive this change through. So we embrace the 5 core principles, and we're asking each individual who signs up to be an ambassador to join this pledge and embrace these 5 core principles that you've seen here. We can talk more about that at a different session if anyone would like.
Great, thanks, Jo. And why the SPP? So I mentioned just a moment ago, it's from procurement and by procurement. It's across the entire hierarchy of an organization. We want leadership to be involved. We want those starting their careers to be involved, and everyone else along the way. And our target is to have 1 million procurement professionals who are part of the SPP by 2030. So help us to get there. And if you've got friends who work in procurement, please share it. It doesn't cost anything. All you need to do is go to our website, have a read and sign up. And finally, just a quick introduction from ourselves. Jo, would you like to go first?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jo Parkin. I'm one of the co-chairs with Seb for the UK chapter. I also work at Capita and Director of Procurement there in terms of driving some of our responsible business and sustainable procurement as well from that perspective.
Thanks, Jo. And I'm Seb Butt, General Manager here at Craft, at Craft, a supplier intelligence company. On the right-hand side, you can see kind of some of the things that we're working towards. Obviously, we're doing Sustainability 102 today. We will also be looking to do a leadership roundtable in the coming weeks and months. And then we're also going to be focusing on a very specific Scope 3 masterclass in the next few months as well. And there's some information which we'll share afterwards if you do want to get involved. Brilliant. As I mentioned earlier, we've got 2 fantastic speakers with us today. I will ask them if they can perhaps introduce themselves, and really it's over to Demi and David for the next part of today's session.
Thank you. Do you want to go first, Demi?
You go first.
Oh, right. Okay, then fine, I will. I'm what I classify myself as a pracademic. In other words, I operate between being a practitioner as well as an academic at the same time. So I specifically spend time helping and advising organizations on lots of different topics, but mainly digital transformations, behavioral science, ESG, sustainability, procurement in general, etc. But also I'm a visiting scholar at the University of East Anglia, where I did my PhD in behavioral science. And I'm also now just appointed a professor of research impact at Leeds University Business School. So with that mouthful, I will pass you over to Demi.
Amazing, thanks, David. And now I have to match that up, right? So I'm also a pracademic. I love how you call it that. So it's funny, we share a similar background, both being practitioners, but also in the academia, looking in more scientific responses or replies or investigations into what's happening in our world. So I've been in sustainability for a long time in various different industries. And I would say I started when it was not in fashion. We were talking about environmental management back then. We were talking about CSR. And now it's just fascinating how the profession has evolved, but also the specialisms within that. From an industry background, I mean, you've read the introduction, so I'm not going to go into detail in that. But yeah, I look forward to sharing with you some insights and also yeah, learning with you as well.
So next slide, please. So what we thought we'd do is we'd go through sort of the opening remarks about the state of sustainability within procurement, because I think that's quite important, because there is I'll call it a series of different perspectives, lenses, challenges in the space of sustainability. We also want to get to talk about the legislation, and there's a lot of that, and I think perhaps some people are perhaps not just aware of how much legislation has come through in the last few years, and further still, there's obviously more to come. One of the things that we did talk about was getting started, which is the sort of the practitioner sort of led session around. So these are the things that we found by experience, Demi, I, Joe, Seb, etc., in terms of what we think would be a good thing to do, as well as some common pitfalls. And then for us, I think it's really important that we get that engagement, I think, as Joe said earlier, and get this interaction going with you guys on the session, in terms of the things that you may want to talk about. And what we might want to do at that point is, depending on how people feel about it, we can either take this recorded or we can take it into Chatham House rules. So in other words, switch the recording off, just in order to get the right level of dialogue and the balance between allowing people to open up and have those, I'll call it, sort of quality discussions about real challenges that they may have in their own practical lives. So next slide then, please. So you've heard from all of us. We're not going to go on to that any further. And so we're going to move on to the state of sustainability within procurement. So next slide, please. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, I find it quite intriguing in a sense, depending on almost which sector, which organization, and indeed, even as I found out, which survey you look at, there is an interesting sort of dichotomy between those that see this as a great opportunity to sort of move sustainability up the agenda. And as you can see, 60% of CEOs said they and their senior leadership team are ready and prepared to tackle this. And on the flip side, you've got then this sort of sliding down the ranks in another survey, and being overtaken by cybersecurity and other wonderful issues that we're challenging and wrestling with today. And so what I find interesting is that again, depending on, as I said, the sector, and it was interesting on our recent roundtable where discussing issues within the food sector, where they're moving to much more short-term contracts, they can't engage in long-term arrangements. Supply chain disruptions are almost invariably preventing them from doing that. And in fact, food producers are saying, we don't want long-term agreements because we just really can't see far enough ahead to be able to put those sorts of things in place. So there are some real practical challenges. And on the flip side of that, I've talked to people who work in property and facilities management, where they're saying, actually, we're doing longer term contracts, we're investing for the future, we're looking at more sustainable contractual arrangements. And so you've got this real sort of dissonance between those different areas. And so I think what you have to do as a procurement professional is to consider, currently, what types of organizations you're sitting in, what sectors. But I think the important thing is to never lose sight of the fact that sustainability has to be a mainstay of what we do, even if there may be instances where, quite rightly and legitimately, there may be some temporary sort of, I'll call it, pauses put in this place, if we're being very honest with ourselves, simply because of the huge disruptions that we're seeing as a consequence, not only of coming out the back of COVID-19, but also the Ukraine-Russia sort of conflict that's clearly affecting lots of food supply chains, fertilizers, oil, energy, etc. So we have to be realists in this space too, as clearly pushing something that isn't going to get traction will not help us, and obviously potentially even damage us, I dare say, as a profession going forward if we're not sensitive to that and in the organizations that we work. So there is a piece of sort of, how can I put it, cold towel over this, really, in terms of how we take this and how we move this forward. So next slide, please. David,
just a quick comment on what you just
go
said,
for it.
really. So effectively, it's important to understand also the role of procurement within sustainability, and obviously how has that evolved, because I've always worked between the two, our sustainability and procurement, and supporting both functions to work together. And it's been really interesting because sometimes, you know, you in an organization, and depending again exactly on what you said, what industry you're in, what exactly is you're procuring, what you're trying to achieve as a business, you get different functions to decide and agree what the direction of travel is for that organization. So if we take the sustainability as a hot topic, normally the targets are being set by corporate affairs. You've got sustainability, even like if we look at net zero, normally you get a function, a small function who is trying to reach any kind of commitment, or there are other client-facing teams like marketing teams that are being pushed to commit to things that effectively the business is not ready yet to do. And so for me, it's really, really exciting to see that procurement now is kind of taking the reins back, and they're trying to, you know, in a way, say we are part of this discussion, you know. And I've seen it, and I've discussed it with many other practitioners where they're like, oh, you know what, we have a net zero target. Unfortunately, we were just told what we need to do. We were not part of that. How do you get there? And actually, within procurement, we understand the practicalities. We understand how to deliver certain things. So all I've seen is the moment you bring procurement into play to either validate, is that guys feasible? Can we actually do it? How much is it going to cost us? The conversation changes, and it brings some sort of pragmatism and reality into it. So that's really, I think, where you also, and all of us, we need to make a more impact and more active, proactive role into, you know, how the organization discusses sustainability, or what kind of targets are we being setting, and what is the direction of travel.
No, absolutely. And I think, you know, to build on that, I think one of the things that, again, as I would say from a behavioral scientist point of view, is to recognize the fact that getting that engagement and getting that ownership of whatever the outcome is, or whatever the journey plan might be, or the direction, hugely important in terms of then getting people to energize behind that and deliver on what is required. I think for me, you know, this whole sort of collective engagement piece is incredibly important. And even if you choose that you know, we're going to have to take a slightly slower than ideal approach to this, it's better to get that sign up and agreement to do that slightly slower but more considered approach, rather than a plan that just nobody buys into, because frankly that just will not make it happen. And as I said before, the risk is that rather than being seen as the sort of the proponents, the catalysts, the facilitators for what is a hugely significant area of importance for procurement and supply chain, we'll do the exact opposite, which is we'll turn people off. And that's the last thing that we clearly want to do. I think another thing that again, you know, what we recognize is that when we talk about sustainability, the interconnectedness of sustainability across the ESG spectrum, which is why I chose this slide specifically, is it's just so intrinsically connected with all the other areas that it can't be seen as a silo. It has to be taken almost as a whole, even down to the things that we talk about in terms of, you know, getting the right sort of governance structure in place, and getting, you know, single points of ownership across, you know, the board of directors and things like that. The same will be true in terms of social value. I know we've got Guy Battle on the list of attendees today. He will recognise too that you know, having that sort of governance, having that sort of sponsorship is hugely important to whatever we do, and is interconnected with all the things that we see there. And I think also getting this sort of this supplier diversity piece connected with what we do in terms of engaging the supply chain, seeing it as more of a collaboration rather than a us and them sort of classic traditional sort of procurement stance or approach, and recognise that a lot of the movement and the shift and the, I guess, the innovation will come through from your supply chain, your value chain, particularly when you recognize that most organizations will contract out 60 to 80% of their spend. So it shouldn't come as any great surprise that actually working with them as partners, as opposed to, in inverted commas, the enemies of the business that are charging us money to do all these things, actually we should take a different approach, or on a more collaborative approach, to get to really deliver on these things. And so that for me is hugely important. I don't really want to add anything else to that.
Just
Demi.
the discussion, David, around sustainability versus ESG. You know, when you did touch on that, you say, you know, it is the same thing effectively, but obviously ESG is being driven by the investor side, because it kind of becomes a rating where they're able to demonstrate progress, to report on things. So for me, sustainability is the overarching, if you like, concept, and ESG brings you down to the very many specific elements you need to look at. And I love how you mentioned supply diversity, because it has really evolved dramatically, and we see lots of commitments from big organizations, and it's a byproduct, if you like, of diversity and inclusion, right? And what we see on this slide, it will have other categories that you have to consider, you have to look at, regardless of what your job title is or what your function is, right? So we have sustainability managers in many organizations that they look after human rights. They're not necessarily called human rights professionals. Or you've got energy professionals, they're called sustainability managers. So for me, it's more about understanding and having an approach that encompasses everything, rather than stacking into titles and ratings, and a debate that doesn't really help and is not, you know, supporting the bigger vision.
Absolutely, thank you. So next slide then, please. And this may sound like quite a dry topic, talking about legislation, but believe me, well, maybe I'm quite sad. I find it quite fascinating and quite important, particularly when you look at the coalescence of, I'll call it, the direction and the topics that are covered from the many countries and legislative authorities that we deal with. So if we can move to the next slide, please. One of the things that struck me particularly was that I'll call it, it's almost like the acceleration factor of legislation and the overlaps that we're now getting in terms of legislation from different countries, but also particularly in the European Union, that then represents, I'll call it, you know, the wider countries within the EU. But even at that, other countries have decided that they want to do something more specific, more tailored to their own sort of supply chain needs and context. And I think what you see here is that you've got lots of things that, you know, as we read across, if you like, the text at the bottom, you know, you've got the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act coming into force 1st of January 2023 for large corporates. We've got medium enterprises that goes live, you know, 1st of January 2024. In 2021, we had 130 new directives just in the area that touch upon corporate governance and sustainability and et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and by the way, there was 5,077 amendments to pre-existing legislation. So that's an eye-watering set of numbers. But then we turn to the US that you know, secretly, you know, the belief is that they are playing a little bit of catch-up. However, they are certainly catching up. Be absolutely clear about that. I mean, the executive orders that have been issued since Joe Biden took office, and those that were sort of sitting in the wings waiting to take place. In fact, even since this slide was produced, the federal marine regulation came in on another executive order, and there's some more in the wings too. So it's a bit like stay awake because it'll all change again tomorrow type of thing. So, and there'll be new legislation. You know, the UK's Environment Act got refreshed, you know, with 5 new core principles really spelled out very, very clearly. And so what we can see is this sort of raising of the bar of the standards, and across that read, you then start to understand, you know, the requirements then, not just purely for reporting, but the fact that people are saying no, don't just do the tick box. This is about saying, demonstrate to us exactly what you have done and how you've done it and why you've done it and what impact that's had. And you know, it's a far more comprehensive set of legislation, and that certainly seems to be the trend that's coming through. I don't know whether you want to add anything at this point, then, before we go across the next.
No, I mean, we've got a few slides on legislation,
Yeah.
don't we? And so there's more discussion on that. And really, the conversation I would like us to have later on is about the common denominator of all of that. And you have touched on it. And also, what does it actually cover? And if you look at it and what businesses are required to do is quite similar. So let's move on, and then we can have a proper conversation on that.
Maybe just one question, if you don't mind, David and Demi. It's come from the audience. Richard is asking, do you see any intent to have a harmonized standard for legislation, I guess, across geographies?
Well, I mean, there has been conversations, and I know at a Home Office perspective, especially with the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australian Modern Slavery Act, then you've got the European due diligence coming in as well, like the German, the French, the Dutch. Yeah, there has been a discussion, but I'm not that confident that we will see something coming in soon. But I don't know, David, what's your view on that? I just can't see it happening very easily.
No, I think there's a, how can I put it, a rose-tinted, how can I put it, aspiration that would be a great place to get to. The reality of getting there, I think, is probably much further in the distance. I may be called out wrong on that, but I just don't see it personally. I just don't see that sort of, I don't see the mechanisms to be able to get that sort of coalescence of the legislation and a leveling almost of the standards. I mean, it's a bit like sort of some of the reporting standards that we see out there. You know, there is no common reporting standard, hence the reason why we've got all the different, you know, S&Ps and all the rest of it sort of thing going on and on, Moody's, etc. So you've got all the different reporting standards. I think probably the more urgent piece for me is to get and to promote a harmonization of the reporting standards would be a really massive leap forward. And even that's going to take several years, I suspect, if not more, to get to that, let alone the legislation. So, you know, I do think we're a way away from that, unfortunately. It's sad, but it's just the harsh reality of where we are.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
And on the reporting side, though, we have seen a lot of trying, you know, to standardize IFRS, etc. And there is a lot of movement. And obviously, why? That's because it's driven by investors, right? They have to find a way to simplify how they report. Now, on the legislation front, I can see some potentially overlapping a little bit, but yeah, I can't see, though, you say, I mean, it's up to you and how you report, and we can talk about that a little bit later as well, that you can potentially cover every single one piece of legislation if your reporting is thorough enough. But like, to see that collaboration, yeah, I'm with David on that.
Thank you so much. What I'm hearing is eventually, I think each of the nations need to get their own house in order first before they start helping the neighbours, I guess. Yeah,
and I think that's probably a good way of putting it, which is about them understanding it better for themselves in the detail, and then going, right, okay, then so this is now how we can start to think about how we can bring this together. But I think that's going to be a slow process. It's certainly not going to be quick. So if we can move to the next slide, thank you. So one of the examples that we sort of pulled out between Demi and I was just to think about the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, because it's probably one of those that's been probably, dare I say, most talked about, most eagerly awaited. But again, you know, breaking this down in terms of what I call bite-sized chunks in terms of, you know, the risk analysis through to your policies and preventative measures, etc. But I think, you know, again, it's setting that common standard for everybody, which I think sets a fairness across all enterprises. It does take an approach that is more prevention rather than cure, which I like. It does drive a greater degree of transparency and ownership. But again, you know, one of the things that is to watch out for is that, as I said, in the first wave, 1st of January 2023, those organizations that have an annual global turnover of 400 million or more are captured in the Act. And then it then goes down to, I think it's 200 million, if my memory serves me right. in the second wave, as I call it. But again, you know, the fines are quite eye-watering. You know, 2% of annual global turnover. You know, all the things which you know prevent organisations procuring in a public procurement context and things like this. But Debbie, I think you probably have been working with this more closely than I have, actually, to be fair.
Well, to be fair, it's more about the analysis of everybody trying to understand, okay, what am I going to be fined if I don't do this, to be honest with you. And you did mention the fines. You know, you've got that fines can range up to 800,000 or 2% of your global turnover if you're earning over 400 million. You've got exclusion from public tenders. You've got lawsuits effectively coming into play as well. So for me, the important part is that, as every other legislation in a way, is being based on fundamental ILO conventions. And that's, again, the discussion we need to have. And you did mention that, David, about the prevention rather than curing it and giving a framework to companies to work with. And that's that, really, from my perspective. I mean, we'll see what's going to happen. But yeah, it's an interesting piece of legislation, definitely.
Okay, next slide, please.
Maybe just one question. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if you guys are kind of, there seems to be, this legislation particularly seems to be in flux. Things keep changing, things keep moving. There was a lot of talk earlier on kind of about looking into those tiered relationships and the entire supply chain, and then I think it was pulled back. Have either of you heard whether that's been finalized, or is it still kind of a moving target?
I haven't seen anything, Seb. I haven't seen any update on that.
I don't think there's any substantive changes, Seb. I think what is being discussed as a potential, I'll call it, amendment in the future, but I think people are tending to keep their powder dry, because what they want to see is, does this work in practice? Are there any unintended consequences? So like any piece of legislation, I wouldn't be surprised if in, I don't know, 2 years' time or whatever, somebody says, here's an amendment to this particular piece of legislation.
Yeah.
I think that's probably entirely conceivable, but I think now, particularly because of the, I'll call it the run up to actually declaring, you know, what the sanctions were and all the other things, and getting it enacted, I think there's a nervousness now not to want to sort of try and, in inverted commas, tinker with it, and set any hairs running about something might change. So I think that's more in the background, and I think it will be. And one of the things that I have seen in the ECJ notes is the fact that they want to observe this along with some of the European EU legislation and learn from each other, and they will share notes about what that then means and how they then might adjust legislation going forward. So there is that recognition that will take place. It's interesting that didn't happen with the French vigilance law back in 2017, but I think there's a recognition now, because there's a growing pressure, as Demi said earlier, from investors and others, that you know, this now has a lot of focus, and hence the reason we're discussing it today. And so I do see that you know, this will continue to move up the agenda in terms of importance, and probably I'll call it cross-sharing of information and knowledge, particularly in the EU member states, for one.
Brilliant, thank you.
So this is something that, oddly enough, Demi and I both shared with each other and said, oh, I've got one of those, and oh, right, you've got one of those, right, okay. So it was more a case of, and I'll let Demi talk to this, because I've done way too much talking already. So, but it was interesting that, you know, individually we both came to the same conclusion. This would be a good way of illustrating what the picture looks like. Demi.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting how it concentrates around, you know, the human rights due diligence as part of businesses need to do it and need to understand how it helps them. Now, I mean, you can Google human rights due diligence, you can find tools online to help you understand how you implement it, but effectively it's a sort of a risk management tool, right? And it helps businesses identify what are their their impacts, how to prevent them and how to mitigate them. And most importantly for me, this whole human rights due diligence really goes back to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And I'm sure most of you are aware of it. Your sustainability teams probably are looking at it, or your human rights team, whatever teams you are working with. And if we talk about responsible sourcing and looking into the ethical issues in supply chains, this is very, very common. And it really gives a framework for businesses to understand what's their role within this whole human rights due diligence. And as a principle, the UNGPs are saying, okay, we've got states to protect human rights. They need to be the ones driving and putting legislation in place to protect workers. And then you've got businesses that have to respect that. And finally, the most important thing, I think, for me is the access to remedy for victims that have actually been impacted by any kind of business-related activity on that front. Now, the business to respect, for me, is a question mark, because we've seen a lot of businesses trying to step up their game. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then you hear the argument of people saying, oh, you know, we are businesses, we're not governments. Governments are there to do that, not us. But then you do see the big companies that are saying, you know what, there's not enough legislation to protect workers. So we're going to do our best with our business policy or our business practices to protect, not just respect. And as I said, when it comes to remedy, I mean, we've seen all kinds of exposés going on, like public from many, many years ago, like in agriculture industry, or if you go to fashion and clothing industry. The question really we all need to think is how easy it actually is and how effective it is to provide remedy to victims. And all I would just recommend to the team here is to really work with organizations and NGOs that they do have the tools and they have programs that they are running for years to actually provide that kind of remedy to workers that have been affected. So, Dave, what it would be interesting to get from you is, whether are you hearing this conversation around what's the role of business? It's not the government, states to do more, or do you have any take on that? And what's your point, obviously, on companies who do take a step further to protect?
Well, I think certainly from my perspective, I think there is now more of a recognition that, and again, it comes back to the sort of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which is prevention versus cure. I think people are now realizing that it is, and in fact, it's actually been called out. You know, this is not a tick box exercise. People have to want to get truly involved. In other words, get their hands into the engine and understand exactly what's going on. And I think, you know, we still see quite high levels of, in relative terms, of human trafficking and slave labor, etc., you know, which is still at a horribly unacceptable level. So, you know, what it says to me is that there is still a huge amount of work still yet to be done in these areas. And I suspect that if when the statistics are drawn over the next year, 2 years, whatever, if those numbers haven't started to climb down, you can imagine, a bit like some of the other pieces of legislation that have been put in place, people will then look for, I'll call it, unwilling volunteers then to be taken to court, because, you know, they will want to make sure that they are seen to be effective, particularly given that, if you like, in a sense, the time and effort that people have gone to put these things in place. But I think the way I would describe it is, for me, the jury is out. My worry is that with all the, how can I put it, pressures on organizations to remain viable, in other words, making sure that they can get supply through, that they can sort of keep their head above water in terms of cost. I think, as we saw early in the presentation deck, this sort of dichotomy between, you know, is this an opportunity or is it something that I can come back to at a later time? As I said, for me, is the slight worry and leaves me thinking, actually, I'm not 100% confident, if I'm being really, really honest, that we will deliver all the things we need to deliver in the near term, because my worry is that there are just too many other pressures on organizations, and therefore we won't have the maximum impact that we can hope for. sadly.
That is a fair point. That is a fair point. And then obviously you've got the other view of, well, you are impacting the society, you're impacting supply chains. You've got to be responsible. You've got to do what's right. So it's always going to be an interesting perspective. And we're going to talk a little bit later on, you know, conflicting targets and conflicting initiatives within the same organization. So this is similar to that, isn't it? Trying to survive and making the right and doing the right thing. It shouldn't cost you more. And we know that it doesn't at the end of the day. But yeah, it's a big conversation.
It is. So next slide then, please. So one of the other things, as I said, there were, you know, literally in the last two years, we've seen 7 dedicated executive orders, and indeed some tangential ones, like the one that, as I said earlier, that have just literally come out, which is the federal marine regulation that is seeking to address, if you like, the shipping and container and port sort of turnarounds within the US. We've got sort of the forced labor law that's coming now, which is actually gone live, which is the, I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing this correct, but it's the URGA Forced Labor Prevention Act. And, you know, when you look at that and you look at the way in which the act is worded, which is if inadvertently in your supply chain, some of your goods are routed through the US, then back into your organization, they're still caught by the act. So, you know, there are quite a few significant issues in this that do actually affect lots and lots of organizations. And again, as you can see in the box below, there's plans are more still to come, particularly in terms of the Clean Future Act in particular, when you look at the sustainability aspects of that and what that will drive in terms of the supply chain, the Green Act, so the renewable energy, the Build Back Better Act. You know, this is about reshoring effectively, you know, lots and lots of activity. But of course, we know that some of those things are going to take quite a number of years to deliver, because if you think about it, you know, we've outsourced, in inverted commas, lots of manufacturing to Asian countries and other continents, and it's taken us decades to do that. So thinking that we're going to just return it all in a few years is just not practical. So you know, there's some quite structural changes behind some of these acts to actually, you know, move some of this forward. But the interesting thing is that is just the sheer quantum and I guess speed, if I'm being quite honest, that the US has acted at to bring about all of these executive orders in a very, very short space of time. And in fact, you know, many of my academic colleagues in the US can barely keep pace with, you know, what's happening and comment upon it and research it. So it is shifting very fast is the only way I can describe that. I don't know, is there anything you want to add to that, Demi?
Not really, no. I mean, it's more about that discussion, right? Like, why does legislation then come in? Why so much legislation? What's happening? And we can cover the Modern Slavery Act, and then we can discuss, you know, what is actually we think is happening and why such a rainfall of legislation.
So let's have the next slide. Thank you. So why don't you take this one, Demi?
Yeah, I mean, we know that the UK Modern Slavery Act really has been under criticism, right? Like, it has no teeth, it doesn't do much. So there is coming an amendment, and effectively we are going to have a single reporting date. That's going to be the end of September each year. It's going to be asking for more credible audits and inspections. We've got the report on the use of employment agents, which is really important. And, you know, coupling with the UK, obviously, Modern Slavery Act, we've got the procurement policy note on taking account of the social value into that. So all of these things, they are interrelated. And the moment you start doing and implementing one, you definitely say, okay, this is related to that. So how does that link? For me, there is a lot of work to be done on the UK Modern Slavery Act. Does it do it? I mean, if we think about it, we are just reporting on what are the things we do potentially. We're trying to be transparent. What are the things companies are doing in respect to modern slavery, right? But actually, if you think about it, we didn't have to say what are the steps we're taking to prevent it from happening, literally though. And what are those anti-slavery steps? You didn't have to list that. And this is the reason the amendment has come in. And this is the reason you receive more criticism. And this is the reason we've seen a plethora of reports analyzing statements and saying, you know, this doesn't do it. This is not good enough. Well, yeah, when you start from a very low compliance perspective to say, oh, I'm going to use defensive language and I'm going to say it is what it is and I'm trying my best, you know, like, and again, I understand as a corporate, you've got to protect what it is you're stating you're doing is actually true and who is reading it. And we've seen this with TCFD and all the climate-related disclosures that they're being taken in a different context from different organizations. You're reporting on something, but then because you're saying something about risk is being taken into completely different perspective, and then organizations are having trouble. And there is this phobia around how much do I share and what do I say? So that's really it. I mean, please do add further bits on that.
No, I think all we're seeing here again is this ratcheting up of the legislation, and I don't think this is the end of the story either. So, you know, what I would urge most companies to do is to think about really documenting and setting out some very proactive steps in what they're doing and how they're making this happen, and being able to properly monitor and measure the impact of those things. And I think what we probably start to see here again is, because this is an amendment to the original bill, it's clear that this is not the end of the journey, and therefore there will be I'll call it an increase in the level of how can I put it, action and consequence in terms of this legislation. And so therefore what I would expect to see is that, again, I think, as I said before, particularly if we're not seeing the statistics move or shift in any particular positive direction, you would expect then that somebody's going to say, right, okay, we now need to go out and evidence why and where this is not happening. And guess what? We'll probably start to see a few people in court because, you know, they will want to show that this act has got teeth and they're serious about it. And in fact, certainly within the public procurement space, you know, the public procurement sort of organizations are well and truly firmly committed and signed up to doing this. So any suggestion that they're not, I think, would be met quite sort of forcibly, I'll call it, in the metaphorical sense, that this is something that the government is very serious about and can't afford not to do. It's one of those things that becomes, you know, whilst we know it is the right thing to do anyway, I think politically, you know, it would be a very sad day to see any politician or governor of a country accused of failing to sort of uphold these kind of standards. So I can't see anybody, whatever colour flag they may be flying, is going to let this one sort of you know, slip between the cracks. I think this would be escalated. So next slide then, please, for me.
David, one more comment really on that for businesses. No, it's fine. We did talk the other day when we were chatting about the content, particularly what are we advising businesses to do and procurement professionals to do, since there's so much coming, but at least what is happening and what is in effect today is very clear. What you can do is a readiness test, right? It can prepare you rather than being, you know, the lastminute.com having to comply with everything. We do really recommend just see what is proposed and what's the gap between to where you are today and where you need to be. So that is really the readiness test for us is the key for you guys to start thinking about. Don't say, oh, you know what, this is not going to happen. And there is actually, I was speaking with some lawyer friends and they were like, you know, it's probably not going to make it, you know, nobody's going to vote for it. but you don't know. And for all the reasons we have just discussed today, you don't know, and it will only get worse. So it's not, you can't just hide and say, oh, I'm hoping it's not going to come. So do the readiness test, be ready for it.
Yeah, I think that's a good shout there, Demi. I think one of the things that again, from business continuity management sort of experience, is that doing that classic readiness test and going, oh, actually, we've got some gaps here, is a great way to find out I'll call it in a safe environment. It's better to do it that way and realize you've got some gaps rather than wait until it's too late, is what I would advocate for sure. So next slide, please. And again, this is more in the spirit of saying, look, in terms of extended producer responsibility that has come in, what we can see is that as an example, just purely in that sort of, in that sort of plastic packaging tax piece that has started this year, you can see how they've laid out very tangibly, because we can almost touch it, feel it, measure it, see it more tangibly, rather than something more difficult like human trafficking, I believe. You can see that this is the direction of travel. So they've laid it out very clearly for us, so there can be no excuses in terms of saying we weren't ready for it. And there are already examples in the world. Canada is a good example where they've used the packaging tax to actually put in place collection and recycling facilities and provision to actually take through the different types and strands of plastic waste. So I think there's plenty of good examples out there in the world, really. So let's move on to sort of the getting started bit. So one of the things that we talked about, so keep moving because I'm just conscious of time here. One of the things that we did do, and obviously this will be in the pack that gets shared, but it's interesting when you start to go, people talk about responsible sourcing, ethical sourcing, and sustainable procurement. There's a huge degree of interrelatedness, and when you take out the definitions, as you can see, I've referenced all of the definitions and where they've come from. But when you start to look at them, you go, yeah, but that touches a little bit on that, and that touches a bit on that. Well, yes, it does, because there is this interconnectedness between all of those areas. And I'm not going to dig into this any great detail, because I think it's important to recognize that it's okay to say, actually, it's not sort of neatly boxed up and there's no connectivity between them. This is simply not true. There is a connectedness between all of these things. We just need to recognize it and be able to articulate it, particularly when we're articulating that back into the business, because if we don't, then obviously, again, we risk leaving people behind as a consequence, which is clearly what we don't want to do. So let's move on to the next slide, and I'm going to pass over to you at this point then, Demi.
Thank you. Yeah, no, really, with this slide, guys, we wanted to kind of touch on, okay, we know what are the definitions and what is sustainable procurement and ethical sourcing, but actually, what are the things we can do as professionals to activate our sustainability thinking within of how we do things and how we operate within our own organizations? And if we ask ourselves, okay, what is sustainability and how can we be sustainable? So if you're not profitable as an organization, you're not going to be sustainable. If you're not resilient, you're not going to be sustainable. And if you're not responsible, clearly, again, you're not going to be sustainable. So it's more about understanding, how do these things link to how do we do what lasts? And then it's more about understanding, how do we transition to that kind of thinking? How do we bring it into our day-to-day behaving, right? And David, you talked about behavioral change here. So we were just thinking, there are 3 really good methodologies to kind of understand where you sit within the business, but also where you sit within your own supply chain as a procurement manager. And there is the systems thinking methodology, we've got scenario planning, and then we've got theory of change. And so systems thinking is really important because it's rooted back with, biology, engineering, ecology. And in a way, it just takes us to think the perspective of the world as a holistic bit, like everything is interdependent and interrelated, as Dave mentioned before. And so we have to understand that whatever we do here now is going to have an impact at some point in, you know, somewhere else, either now or in the future. And so with scenario planning, again, is all about understanding and bringing this new way of thinking. So what is the bigger picture here? What are the connections between to what I'm doing and what my suppliers are doing? What are these relationships? And again, there are relationships between different variables. With whatever you do, whatever your contract is looking like, or whatever your task is you've got to do. And then, you know, you start thinking about the future, you start thinking about different viewpoints. And it is about, again, understanding how you can influence that. And the future is not fixed, and especially if we start thinking about scenario planning. So the reason you can achieve your targets on savings is because you have visualized what it is you need to do. So this is similar to sustainability. We kind of need to understand how can we imagine a different outcome and a different future and create that preferred future, right? And also thinking we've got to change something. And we've got the great saying from Albert Einstein there. And it's true, because we have to understand through the theory of change. And then you guys look it up. I mean, there's lots of research around that. So what hinders change, and how can we make better decisions to bring that positive change? Now, it is about that positive thinking. It is about problem solving. And what's the relationship of, you know, how do we bring that to an ESG program? I mean, David, we had a massive conversation around, you know, change management, right? Which is similar to bringing sustainability into that. What's your view on that? And also, of course, trying not to get stuck with one particular aspect of your program, of your procurement category even, you know, it's not all about costs, it's not all about savings.
Yeah, I mean, I think bringing in anything like this, Demi, is really effectively a change program, because you're asking people to do different things, work in a different way. And so what you have to think about is, what are the motivations for people to want to work in a different way? What are the opportunities does that present them with? You know, what capabilities do we need to give these people to be able to be effective and not feel it's almost providing that safety net that says, don't worry, it's okay. We'll help you through this. We'll support you. And this is the training and development we'll give you. This is how we'll enhance your career and your worth as an individual in terms of the procurement profession. So I think we have to think about it in terms of how can we make this more impactful at an individual level and not just at the organizational level. And so thinking about this in terms of how we enable people is hugely important. And I think for me, you know, there are lots of things that we can do from a behavioral science perspective that helps that journey. And therefore, again, I think it's just looking to the strengths and capabilities of the team that you've got, and utilizing those to good effect, but recognizing, of course, that it is a change, and therefore we do need to support people in that change journey.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's brilliant. And so if we move on to the next slide, we wanted to say to kind of, you know, we talk about sustainability, it's about sustaining, right? Being within the limits. But what is next? And I'm sure many of you have seen people talking about regenerative agriculture or regenerative design. And there is regenerative mindset and leadership, actually. And since we're talking about behaviors and how we can influence that, I just wanted to bring to your attention, and obviously with David's background in behavior change, that we can move beyond sustainability. There is something beyond sustainability. And it's interesting, just a couple of definitions really, like what is regeneration, right? Like, and how do we get there? So it's to bring new and more vigorous life, the process of creating and increasing levels of health. So it's like regenerating, recreating. And there are lots of academics writing about that. And we do have a couple of references down there. But what I wanted, again, us to kind of touch upon is the leadership we bring, and how do we become that regenerative leader within our organization. And the picture I have here is from a book I've read recently, and it's about us trying to understand not just pieces of the organization in order to become the regenerative leaders, but also, you know, the relationships between these parts. And the organization is a complex living system, right? And so it's really fascinating. And if you have time, look it up and read it. It's really challenging our current way of thinking. And in a way, they're just telling us, Giles Hutchings and Laura Storm, that we have to develop two core capabilities here. It is about self-awareness and systemic awareness. And so self-awareness comes really down to a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension, sorry. So the horizontal dimension is about the quality of attention we bring into the moment. So think about it, how many times we are in discussions with colleagues or with our families and we're not there, we're not present in the moment. So this is about being self-aware of where you are and what it is you're bringing into the conversation. So it goes down to really presence and purposefulness. What's your purpose within whatever it is you're doing? And then the vertical dimension is talking about consciousness. And I mean, you've seen about biases and you've seen a lot, like people talking about how they perceive the world. And so effectively what they're telling us in the book, which is again fascinating, is that we see what we see, but we don't know what we don't know. And that as we look at the sky, we look at the road, we look at our colleagues, we look at anything, we are managing, controlling and filtering. And in a way, we're limiting our experiences of what life is. And so they challenge you to kind of start looking things from a different perspective. And finally, about systemic awareness, we talked about systems thinking, which was all about understanding, you know, that everything is interconnected and there are parts of a system that we can influence and affect. Now, what they say is that you have to become part of that system. So with systemic awareness, you suddenly put yourself into that systems thinking, into that particular system. And in a way, you are trying to be more attentive, you're trying to control your own biases and participate in that system that you are, because you are effectively receiving the knowledge, the expertise, the feelings and the emotions of whoever is in that system. So it is a little bit to geek out, I appreciate that, but it's really good. Please do read, because it just brings that hope of what is beyond sustainability. Amazing. Dave, any comments from you or?
No, nothing from me. I think that was well delivered. So let's move forward then in the interest of time. So we want to talk about a discussion on differences and similarities, which I think is really quite important. But I think thinking about sort of, you know, what things that we can do in terms of different things that and different approaches that we can take. I mean, one of the examples that Demi and I talked about, just to bring this to life, was often people talk about, you know, a car fleet policy or whatever it happens to be, but we can change the dialogue to talk about a mobility policy. As an example that I did in one organization, where we talked about the fact that we incentivize people to actually use public transport, and they are actually rewarded to do that rather than penalized because they lost their car allowance. And so changing the dynamics of the way in which this works is all within our gift. And this is about then influencing and changing policies, delivering value to organizations, but at the same time, delivering a sustainable solution. So this is about the critical thinking that's necessary around saying what's interconnected, how can I influence it, how can I shape it, and being that sort of almost, I call it the value architect in the business, to think about how you do this stuff. And there are many tangible and practical examples. I'm sure you've got some too, Demi.
Yeah, I mean, for me, really, it doesn't matter where you sit or within the business. Are you direct procurement, indirect procurement? Are you in sourcing? Obviously, when you're doing sourcing of a product or commodity, it's a lot easier to understand the impact, it's a lot easier to map it, it's a lot easier to see it. Now, if you're in indirect procurement and you're suddenly dealing with, I don't know, professional services, IT, whatever, it becomes a little bit more complicated, but it's all about the same principle. It's all about relating back to what it is you can influence with your own supply list, your categories, and what are the impacts of the product or the service that you are managing. So we will talk about it later. So let's move on, Dave.
Yeah. So here, you know, one of the things that I often talk to people about, and I think Demi's in the same space, which is often people think, crikey, this is a big subject, and I need to do the research, and I need to do all this sort of stuff. Often not, just making a start around some of the basics and the fundamentals will help you gain a better understanding, understand better the connectivity of different areas of the business or your supply chain. And so just simple questions like, well, who owns sustainability? Who is the board person that's actually, responsible for this? Who operationally is going to deliver this? Where does it apply in the business? Even down to just drawing up a simple racing model, to say who's responsible for something, who's accountable, who do we need to communicate with, who do we just simply need to inform, setting up cross-functional working groups, again, getting back to this, let's make sure people own the solution that we come out with, because that's really, really important. And then moving on then to the next slide, if I can, very quickly, which is, if we think about then, just doing this gap analysis on, so what policies, procedures, and codes of conduct do I need? So for me, this is sort of what I call the archetypal. This is the core base list. This is what it includes on the right-hand side. What have I got? What's already in the organization? Where are my gaps? And how do I then weave this golden thread of cross-referencing between one piece of code or policy or whatever it happens to be, and recognize that some will be for internal consumption, some is for external consumption, some is even for consumption internally and externally. You think about all of these different things, but also recognize then that in doing something like this, making these visible, making them transparent, making sure that you have even set up training sessions sometimes internally, bite-sized training sessions that helps people understand what this is about, how it touches their role or what they do, their tasks, their activities, whatever it happens to be, so that the whole thing becomes part effectively of I'll call it an ecosystem across the business that you need to sort of recognize. And even thinking about sort of making this ostensibly part of the DNA of the business. So it's not something that's, it's those compliance people over there. No, this is part and parcel of what you do as part of this business. So it's not seen as separate to, but an integrated part of business as usual. Anything you want to add to that, Demi?
No, I completely agree. There's nothing to add to that. It is about the baseline. It is about your policies, because they will tell you what it is you need to do. And then you have your procedures and your execution plans to tell you how you're going to do it. So that's great. Okay.
So let's move on then. And I'm going to hand over the microphone to you, Demi, at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so really, what we wanted again to do is to tell you that you don't have to start building a program from scratch. You can really use what you do on your daily basis, on your routine with the procurement cycle as procurement professional. So all you've got to do is start building on those blocks that you have already laid down. And for me, risk is a big part of that, because it kind of guides you through the procurement cycle, and it allows you to not to do everything at once. You take time to understand what it is happening. So I've got the procurement cycle in front of us. Obviously, that's from SPP, and that's what we all do on a daily basis. So where you can break down the understanding of risk, of course, sustainability is part of that. And as you can see, we've got the risk taxonomy there, which I've taken from the Centre for Risk Studies from the Cambridge Judge Business School. They've got an amazing, comprehensive risk taxonomy there with everything you can think of. So look it up. So once you start looking at what it is I want to procure, what the business asked me to do, what's the need, you can identify that vulnerability and risk that's related to it. You don't have to do more than that. You have to do a complete risk analysis. But then as you move with your strategy and the plan and the market testing, you start building on understanding and prioritizing, okay, I've got to do X, what's the risk, how am I going to deal with that? And then it becomes really concrete on, when you start actually setting your specification, you do your supply selection, even on your RFP, you can set that criteria and you can start collecting little by little what information you need. So through the tender, you can find a lot of information about your suppliers. You didn't need to do that at stage one when you were start looking at the business need. And that's the same logic where once you have the contract live, manage your supplier. You've got your QBR, speak to them, understand what are their own risks. Because again, don't put your own biases. You think, oh, they are high risk on that. And indeed, they might be because of the industry they are operating in, and the inherent risk is high, but the mitigation they've got in place is actually quite good. So it brings the risk down, and therefore there is not much for you to worry about. And this is the process that you have to look at what you do on every day, on a daily basis, if I may say. So just putting at the heart of what you do, what are the business policies you're operating with? Do you have your ESG understanding? What is the procurement function is trying to achieve? And really, as you go through that, you will be able to build up on it. And we've done that previously at an organization who worked where through the RFX process with the RFP, we broke down what is the information we need as we were moving along with the suppliers. So we had 10 suppliers. We're not going to ask all of them to give us detailed answers about everything, right? There is no need for that. You just cherry pick what are the things you need to know to do business with ethical businesses, like that they share your own values. And then as you move on with your selection process and shortlisting, you can ask more and get more detail. And if we move on to the next slide, Seb, just really, that's another example of how you can do your own risk assessment as part of that process. I mean, you can build your own maturity framework. You don't have to have a very sophisticated one. You start, for example, level 1, it's foundations and compliance. Make sure you're a compliant business. You do business the right way. Level 2 could be beyond compliance. What are the things I could build up upon? And level 3 could be your horizon scanning, right? Like could be your innovation, because unless you have the foundations in place, you're not going to be able to do any innovation and move on and have a better impact. So, I mean, there is software out there. We know that there is technology, and please let's use more technology and digitalization. We need it. It's more accurate, it's faster, it's better. But if you have to do it manually, start with an overall risk profiling and prioritize based on country. There are so many indices out there you can look at, like the Global Slavery Index, there's an ESG index, and etc. And we will share some links of those. Then put the category in, like what is the category risk potentially, what's the industry, and also your supplier, what kind of supplier you're working with. And then again, as you advance it, you can add more specification around, oh, what is the category I'm dealing with? Is it software or hardware, for example? Where is these laptops coming from? Where do my data centers are? Blah, blah, blah. And you build like this. And then obviously, as you very well know, due diligence with suppliers is a big topic, and everybody's overdoing it at some point without really looking what the results are. So be mindful of what it is you want to do. But there are ways, and don't think it's a hard thing, and you don't have to do everything at once. Build it throughout the whatever you do on a daily basis. David, anything you want to add on that?
No, I think the only thing I would add is sort of, if you look at the Transparency International stuff that you've got in the first box there, it was always a good thing for me to sort of say, have I got supplies coming from, the green countries, the amber countries, or the red countries in very simple terms? And you determine that, yeah, fine, keep going. If it's a green country, if it's an amber country, I'll do a bit more due diligence. And if it's a red country, then actually I shouldn't really be doing business with them, because there is a good chance that there's fraud and corruption in that supply chain, and therefore, not good to do business with. So you can take some very, very simple, practical steps in this space to sort of really help you sort of, I'll call it, structure the way in which you engage the supply chain in a very sort of simple and easy way, if you structure it in the right way, whether you do that digitally or whether you do it manually. Just simply setting those things up and almost taking that sort of, I'll call it, slightly simpler and perhaps a bit more macro level type approach, is when you're setting up a program, may well be the good place to start and get that sort of, how can I put it, that sort of base position in place. You can fine tune it afterwards, don't worry. But doing the basics to begin with is a really good place to start. So next slide, please. And again, you look at this diagram and you go, oh, wow, there's a lot there. But actually what it does, it gives you just this visual overview for those of you or more visual people rather than text or any other sort of way, of just going, right, okay, I get it. I see how these things, all these different things come together and how they're covered within the ISO 20400, which is the ISO for sustainable procurement. And so what you can see here, in a sense, is the ways in which you can consider different things at different stages, and how that architecture all just comes together. And it might help you conceptualize it when you're framing your questions for your RFQ. It might help you, for your evaluation criteria, all those different things. And you can just distill that then down into this is the way I do my process right the way through from start to finish. So it becomes part of your BAU. I really don't want to say much more about it than that. I don't know whether you want to say any more about that.
We talked about, visualizing and potentially creating your new futures, the preferred futures you want to have within the organization or within your own category, and if we bring it really close to heart. So it's very easy to show you that, but also I would say don't try and make it perfect as well. There are other standards. We've got ETI, like the ethical trade initiative, to help you with some guidance. Like, just make a start. Don't go to analysis to paralysis. So just start with the basics.
Yep. So next slide then, please. So what we thought, we'd just come up with a bit of a summary right at the very end. And what we've done as well is we put a bank of stuff in the appendices that we're not going to go through today because there's way too many of them, but that they're there to refer to. But what we thought about was just think about the simple things that, where are all your documents going to be hosted, how they're going to be accessed, how will you make them transparent, agree the scope and the remit of the audit above the statutory level. So as we discussed earlier, the chances are that, it's going to get more and more, I'll call it intensive, as other iterations of legislation go through. And there's a good reference to the Bryden report there that I put into the appendices. Automation of the social value contribution via the social value portal, or however you choose to do it. Again, it's just making it sort of an easier way to deliver it, a more transparent way. It's consistent. Etc. Adoption. The great thing amongst all this is to say, let's agree collectively across the business, how are we going to get this internal and external engagement, collaboration, and launch done? Because without that, it's not going to happen. You don't assume that people know about all this stuff. So think about communications, simple one-pager guides, tutorials, workshops, etc. And what you will recognize as well is that don't treat all entities in your supply chain the same, particularly SMEs, where you've got some people wearing multiple hats, from operations to ESG to safety to whatever. You're going to have to make sure that you help them more, particularly if they're an integral part of your supply chain. And think about, so can I open up some drop-in sessions? Make things slightly more informal, but nevertheless informative in the sense of the content that you give them, kickstart packs, little sort of sheets that they can utilize for themselves, self-service portal, whatever. And then start to think about, on the flip side of that, that might help me then in terms of all the things around how I can market my organization as being better to do business with for them and for us. Think about sort of how you sort of get this single taxonomy of classification across the business. One of the things that often people stumble across is this thing called materiality. It's really, really important to define what you mean by materiality, and you'll have lots of opinions on that, from legal, compliance, quality, supply chain operations. So it's really super important that you get a common definition of what materiality is. Simple things like a common asset register for ease of reporting. One of the things that you'll find is that as you go through, if you haven't got this common asset register or common register for things, it becomes super difficult then to be able to report, and it becomes a real, I'll call it, mammoth task then when you do need to report on these things. And think about the way in which you develop a set of e-learning and other tools that you can quite easily embed into lots of the for instance, HR platforms or other platforms where, you can then see who's done the training, who's got the information, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some real, simpler and quick wins to take out of this that can significantly move you, up the field. So I'm not going to say much more about that, because we'll lead straight into what we call the common pitfalls, and I'll leave Demi to lead that session.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's exactly what we recommended doing. The common pitfalls will be not having clear ownership, not understanding exactly what the ESG factors you need to concentrate on. And that's why I always try to bring it back closer to heart, to your categories, to what you know, to your suppliers, because that will give you the guidance of the things you know, and it will be easier to identify what you don't know. Clear roles and responsibilities, that is very important. And also, as part of your goals and targets for the year, I mean, we always recommend clarifying what are these, so you don't have people being confused with vague targets. And then again, differences between, what's legal, what's company policy, what do I need to do? So don't get confused, just get straight what it is you need to do with the baseline, as we talked about, with the, clear ownership, with not being afraid to say also you don't know, right? One of the biggest things I've seen companies and actually people do is just cherry picking the easy bits, right? Because that's convenient to do. Don't do that. It doesn't matter if you're related or associated with the difficult thing you've got to deliver. Let's say on environment like plastics is something that you guys are really involved in. Attack it. Just understand though what's your impact and how you can make it better. Don't just choose, oh, we chose this, let's say, global development goal because it's easy, it's nice, we're doing it. And the biggest conversation I hear is all about, okay, we've got to prioritize, right? And of course, we all have to prioritize. There's so much, there are so much resources you can use, but really choose what is actually relevant to your business, to your category, and where you can have an impact. That's from me as well on that pitfall side. David, if you don't want to add anything, we can move on into questions.
No, I think typically what I would say to people is, just focus on selecting 4 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals out of the 17. Don't try and choose and do all 17 because you'll fall over. It's just not practical. Yes, there'll be an interconnectedness, but just being focused and being clear on those things, and just maybe just doing a few things really well and starting to build is a good way to go. And I think for me, just accepting that you don't know it all, and sometimes even reaching into your supply chain and saying, how have you done this? You've got a similar business to us, you've got a similar supply chain to us. Can we have a conversation? And oddly enough, I found, certainly by experience, that talking to people, it's amazing the amount of stuff that people are willing to share and talk to you about. And I think that don't lose that opportunity. And back to the sort of the point that we made in the the common pitfall slide, which is just ask. Just ask. If you don't know, just ask. Because if you don't ask, you don't get, as they say. And I think that's just has to be the mantra in this space, because the harsh reality is that nobody has all the answers, and so we accept the fact that whilst we might have quite a few of the answers, we certainly won't have all of them. So it's about being human in this space and looking for and seeking collaboration and support from other areas of the business, for sure.
Well, David, that's why we've got the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, don't we, Seb and Joe?
Absolutely.
I was doing a little bit of moonlighting last night, and I attended one of the US chapter sessions.
All right.
And there was a fairly long discussion around how those that work in procurement and supply chain leave those competitive forces at the door and very, very open to collaborate. And I think partly it was coming from because everyone is feeling in the dark to a point, and they're trying to figure out the best way forward for their organization. So it's nice to see that collaboration. And as Demi just said, we hope that the SPP enables some of those discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're going to pass it back to you and Joe now at this point.
Yeah, we've got a fairly yeah, quite a few questions that have come through from the group. So we've got a few minutes to go, but we'll try and get through a couple of these. One, I guess, is related to, Demi, that fascinating slide that you had, and you were talking about regenerative leadership. So we have Guy who asked, how can a procurement lead become a regenerative lead as well? And does this need a change in mindset?
Yeah, well, so that's the wrong question for the 5 minutes we have, Seb, but effectively what I will say is, please do read the book. And in a way, I know it's difficult sometimes. These are concepts that are quite theoretical, but this isn't actually, because you can implement it through your day and you can say, okay, how can I think in a better way? What is, how can I regenerate? And I'm not going to lie, there is research around, okay, how do we implement that in procurement? Can a procurement function bring regeneration into and from out the supply chain? So I don't have a short answer to how do we do that, but it's all about practice, and is primarily when you are with your colleagues, when you're with your family, with your friends. I have found it really hard to be present. It's either you're on your phone or you're like taken away thinking something else that happened at work. And presence is key to understand what it is you bring into that discussion. Otherwise, you're wasting everybody's time. And also understanding what's your purpose within that discussion, within the business, within your category. And that forces you to think a little bit differently about the impact you can have. As procurement professionals, we have an amazing power. I'm just so thrilled to see procurement is finally on the driving seat.
Brilliant. Thanks, Demi. A couple of people have noticed we've got a very astute audience here. And David, they said that they noticed the omission, I guess, of the Social Value Act. Is that because the legislation is principally focused on the public sector? Just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on maybe why that wasn't focused on. I think it was reflected on one of the last slides.
Yeah, so the risk is that you could include legislation from such a wide draft that you could end up sort of how can I put it, putting in lots of things. Clearly, you saw on the earlier slides that we did reference social value. We did reference the fact that there's the social value portal if people want to capture the social value that they want to bring into projects. I'm very conscious of the fact that there is how can I put it, there has been to date a predominance of that more within the public sector, but it's coming across into the private sector. But it is an intrinsic part of what we would do. And the recognition, as we said before, this interconnectedness of ethical sourcing, sustainable procurement, et cetera, the interconnectedness is all there. And the risk is that this session, as we said to you very early on, Demi and I, we could have made this a 15-hour session, not 1.5 hour session, move the decimal point one, because there's just so much to cover. So it wasn't an intentional omission. We hopefully have how can I put it? I'll call it signposted it, but we certainly haven't omitted it.
Can I add, Seb, on that? There is a bit of a misunderstanding on how to implement social value in the private sector. And, the reason for that is, and I'm a social value practitioner myself, it's very hard to tangibly report on what's the value you've created through a procurement exercise, because it's not about what you think you've created, it's about what the beneficiary thinks the value was. So let's say we did a procurement exercise, we included lots of people from the community. You go interview these people, there's a whole process to get feedback, to understand how has that impacted your life? And they might say to you, oh, you know what? That for me, if I had to put a monetary value next to it to give you the social value, it was £100,000. When you'll be thinking, oh, that was only 10K for what we spent. So it's completely irrelevant. But we can do another session on that. It's just a massive topic and very misunderstood. So
fantastic. Well, I think we're at time. There's lots more questions. Maybe we can share some of these afterwards. Well, I'd like to thank Demi, you and David. Thank you so much for the session today. I think the audience has been extremely pleased. We had, and the questions are kind of an indication of that. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I mean, this community doesn't work without people like yourselves giving up your time and coming along and speaking to this ever-growing procurement audience. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for else attending. You can find today's session. We are going to post it on the SPP website. If you're not an ambassador, do join, become an ambassador. 5 things you need to pledge to. And then we'll also put these slides up onto the SPP website as well. And then look out for us, notifications about future events that we're going to be holding. So we'll be making some announcements in the not too distant future. Thank you, everyone. You can all go now and start your weekend. It's still nice and hot outside. Go and grab a beer, grab a glass of wine, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.